Hi, this is Grant with Fight for Forensics, and today we're going to be introducing LD, and this is going to be done in such a way that explains competitive debate to people who have little to no experience with it. So if you've done debate tournaments before, this probably won't have too much that's helpful for you unless you've done maybe speech and you're just learning LD now. So once again, we're just introducing LD. But first we're talking about what competitive debate is as a whole, and then we're talking about what makes LD a special event, how it's unique from other events that you may or may not have experience with. It doesn't really matter here. And then we're just going to be talking about what a tournament looks like, and the reason I want to put this in here is just because I find a lot of novices don't really know what to expect their first tournament, so they might spend a lot more time worrying about that, and it might hurt their performance, but either way, we're just going to talk about a few things there just so you're a little more comfortable if you've never been to a tournament before. So to begin, what is debate? So if you look up the definition on Google, you get this result. It's to argue about a subject, especially in a formal manner. And whenever you hear the term debate, something you might think of off the top of your head is the presidential debates. Good news. Competitive debate is nothing like this. So a working definition that I just wrote up here for competitive debate is that it refers to competitions in which two opposing teams or individuals argue either in favor of or against a proposition using a fixed time limit. The winner is the one who best satisfies some sort of given criteria. And a way to understand how this contrasts with the other types of debates you may be a little more familiar with is that the debates you see in general are about reaching the truth. They're about figuring out maybe which president's the best president for us, or what type of foreign policy stance should we take. This is not competitive debate. While we may be arguing about those same topics, and we're obviously going to be getting a lot of educational benefits through doing that, we're going to become informed citizens, competitive debate in of itself is a game with rules and strategies. And how we go about using those rules and strategies is the entire focus of this video series, because it can be pretty complicated. So what is Lincoln Douglas debate as an event? Lincoln Douglas debate, or LD, is a one-on-one debate format focused on ethical issues. In other words, we're usually asking questions like, what is good or right for us to do? One way that LD might contrast with other debate events is that there's a focus on general ethical principles rather than specific circumstances. For example, one Lincoln Douglas topic that I remember debating years ago was whether or not individuals have a moral obligation to help people in need. In contrast, let's say you're in congressional debate, you're usually going to be asking questions about a specific bill, which is a really specific action that we should take right now. That's not what you're doing in LD. There's a little bit more abstraction going on. Additionally, in LD there's a greater focus on figuring out what is good, right, and ethical in the first place, rather than accepting some sort of common good standard that we would in most other arguments. So another way to think of this is that an LDer is going to have to ask questions like, is happiness more important than human freedom, or is it the other way around? Or maybe, do the needs of the many outweigh the rights of the few? So another way to think of this is that an LDer is going to have to ask questions like, is happiness more important than human freedom, or is it the other way around? Or maybe, do the needs of the many outweigh the rights of the few? Now, while these really abstract concepts may be things that LDers are going to have to deal with during their career, it's also important to realize that an LD debater must also apply these topics to actual resolutions. For example, not all topics are going to be really abstract, and some of them are going to require that we combine the abstract elements with those that are a little bit more common sense, that is, the practical implications and how they play out. For example, you don't just have to show that happiness is more important than freedom, but also that your side is actually going to be upholding happiness or promoting it in some way, which is something that your opponent's obviously going to disagree with you on. So let's look at some sample resolutions, or topics for debate. I'm just going to throw 5 topics on here. These are the 5 from the 2014-2015 season. After I throw these up here, just pause the video for just a couple seconds and just look at them. If you don't really understand them, that's fine. So one thing that you'll notice is that they do have a general degree of abstraction. None of the resolutions even specify a specific government. Now, while in other cases you might have resolutions that specify, for example, the United States government, as a general principle, we can realize that LD resolutions don't ask specific questions about specific actors. Rather, they ask more abstract principles. Now, one of the more specific resolutions you'll get is the January-February resolution, which asks whether or not just governments ought to require that employers pay a living wage, which is a pretty specific type of economic policy. On the other end of the spectrum, you have questions like that of the 2015 NSDA tournament, which asked whether inaction in the face of injustice makes individuals morally culpable. So, while you can see that there are certainly some resolutions which are more specific than others, all of them still have some degree of abstraction in them, and that's something that's just kind of innate to the nature of LD. When a lot of people see these topics, they're kind of overwhelmed, and they ask, how do I, prove this true or false in the first place? It's okay to feel overwhelmed, because these are pretty open-ended topics with a lot of different ways that you can approach them. And that's why LD can be challenging, but that's also why it can be good. But once again, the focus of how to prove these statements true or false and how you should do that most effectively, that's what this entire video series is about. It's not a simple question. Next, we're just going to talk about some more logistical things with the event itself. One thing to note is that the LD topic changes every 2 months. So you'll have a topic for September, October, November, December, and so on. And then there's one topic that's only used at the National Speech and Debate Association National Tournament. The next thing I want to talk about is the speech times, because this is another thing that is really important to novices, even though once you've done it a couple times, you'll have a pretty good grasp on this. So the first speech is the affirmative constructive. Now this is a 6-minute speech in which the affirmative introduces the debate and just argues their overall position. They don't have to respond to any arguments because the other person hasn't spoken yet. Rather, they're just giving their own arguments. Next, there's a 3-minute cross-examination period, or question and answer period. In this period, the negative debater gets to ask the affirmative debater questions about their case or about the resolution as a whole. Now, one thing that's important to note is that in LD, unlike, for example, public forum, the question and answer period is one-directional. The negative is asking the affirmative questions, rather than it being back and forth with questions. Following this cross-examination, there's the negative constructive, which it's a bit of a misnomer. So within this 7-minute speech, the negative doesn't just give their own arguments, but rather they also have to apply to the AC within that same 7-minute period. So while it's a 7-minute speech, in reality the constructive itself might only take up about 3 minutes of that speech, and then the other 4 minutes would be responding to the affirmative case. Following this speech, there's another cross-ex period. In this case, it's the affirmative asking the negative questions. After this comes the 1AR, or first affirmative rebuttal. Now in this 4-minute speech, the affirmative has to both respond to the attacks made against their own case, as well as offer criticisms of their opponent's case. After this, there's the negative rebuttal, which is a 6-minute speech in which the negative once again has to go over both cases, and then also conclude to the judge at the end of the speech how they've won the round and put everything into a big picture. And after this, there's the final speech of the round, which is the 2AR, the second affirmative rebuttal. This is a 3-minute speech in which the affirmative has to explain to the judge how they've won the round. And lastly, both debaters have 4 minutes of prep time. Prep time is time that can be used to look through old notes or evidence that you have, or just do anything you want to do before you give the next speech. It's your preparation time. This time can actually be used in between any of the different speeches. Additionally, debaters get to control how much of that prep time they use, rather than it being a 4-minute fixed block. So for example, the negative debater may want to use 2 minutes and 15 seconds before their negative constructive, just so they can use that time to figure out what they're going to say against the affirmative's case. And although I have 4 minutes on here, there are some regions where you might have 3 minutes, some regions where you might have 5 minutes, but the general norm is 4 minutes, but that might be different in your area. And lastly, we're just going to be talking about tournaments as a whole, just a few things so you know what to expect, so you're a little bit less nervous. So the first thing to note is that tournaments are held at schools, rounds are held in classrooms. A lot of people that don't have exposure to debate might imagine that it's in some sort of auditorium, and that's how it might be depicted whenever you see debate featured in the media. But this isn't usually the case. Additionally, most local tournaments have 4 rounds, in which you debate both sides twice. So make sure that you're putting your own personal biases aside and you're creating good cases and rebuttal strategies for both sides of the resolution. Next, you'll get what's called a competitor code. Now, a competitor code is just a code that matches up to you, so you can look at a schematic or a posting sheet and figure out where you have to go. So the sheet would look something like this. So you'll see that what the sheet has is, for every different competitor, what side you're on, who your opponent is, what room you're in, and what judge you have. Most sheets will look something like this. So one thing is make sure that you do have access to this code. Make sure you don't forget to see your coach at the beginning of the tournament. Most of the time, competitor codes are given to the coaches when they show up to the tournament and they register. So make sure you get your competitor code before the tournament starts. And lastly, one concern that a lot of people have before they go to their first tournament is that they're terrified of some sort of audience watching them speak, and they don't want this big public speaking event. Well, the good news is that there usually won't be any sort of an audience except for your judge. In most rounds, the exception being some elimination rounds at certain tournaments, the only people in the round are you, your opponent, and the judge. So don't worry about giving speeches in front of big crowds. The only way that's usually going to be happening is if you're doing really well. So that's all I have for right now. I hope that if you've never had any exposure to debate, that this may be a little bit helpful to you. And if you have any specific questions, go ahead and ask. Or you could ask your coach how tournaments run, that type of thing. Just don't worry about it, because remember, everybody was new at some point. And there's a very good chance your judges knew as well. So don't feel like an outsider to the activity. Just give it your all, and you'll figure out debate as you go. This has been Grant with Fight for Forensics. Thank you.